Hello to everybody, and first of all, thank you for inviting me here. In the next couple of minutes, I will talk about a very specific archaeological site in northern Syria, which is called Tell Majnuna. This site is a part of the suburban area of Tell Brak, which is a famous site that was established at least in late Chalcolithic and flourished in the late Chalcolithic, being one of the earliest urban center of the Near East, and then continued as the capital city of the Kingdom of Nagar in the 3rd millennium BC, and finally was abandoned in the very beginning of the maybe not in the very beginning, in the 2nd millennium BC, from which there is relatively well preserved Mitanni building on the top of the site. Tell Brak was excavated for many years. First, it was excavated by Max Mallowan before the Second World War, and Mallowan found two spectacular buildings at Tell Brak. One of them was so-called idol temple, which was dated to the Chalcolithic. And the second was so-called Naram-Sin fort from late 3rd millennium BC, and both were relatively well preserved and produce a lot of evidence that was used to trace the history of northern Syria back to the late Chalcolithic. Tell Brak is located in so-called Habur Triangle in the dry farming zone, extending from Habur in the west to Wadi Rumelan to the right, as you see on this slide. And Tell Brak is located more or less in the central part of this triangle, which for sure was a good strategic position, allowing control over the communication route going both from east to west and from north to south. Tell Brak itself is a huge archaeological site with the elevation of more than 30 meters above the surrounding plain, and actually it resembles some perhaps natural hills even, and not the archaeological site. It is surrounded by some minor tells, and for example, here to the east you can see Tell Temi, which was also occupied in the late Chalcolithic, and in the northwest there is Tell Majnuna, which is the focus of my talk today. At Tell Brak itself, there was a very long-lasting project by Joan and David Oates that started in late 1970s, and it continued until the outbreak of the civil war in Syria. So Tell Brak was quite intensively excavated for more than 40 years. Producing a lot of evidence about the early urban center, many interesting public buildings, and of course also many human remains that made possible some insight into the quality of life, the history of mobility, and some other bioarchaeological topics. However, I won't talk about Tell Brak very much today, because I would like to focus on Tell Majnuna, which was actually quite an accidental finding in 2006, because it was a very humid spring. The local government decided to store surpluses of grain, because it was really nice harvest that year. They decided to store them in some outdoor areas, like this one, which is visible on this picture. And accidentally, it appeared that one of those storage places was organized just in front of Tell Majnuna. And to protect this provisional granary, the local government decided to produce a fence around all this area. And during excavation of trenches for this fence, it appeared that there is a lot of pottery, a lot of animal bones, ashes, and also some human remains, at least in that southern part and north eastern part of the trench. And for that reason, the archaeological team excavating at Tell Brak decided to do some rescue excavations that lasted just for 1 week to understand what happened at Tell Majnuna. And that year we were just able to excavate just a small trench here in the area MTW. But the next 2 years, 2007 and 2008, were devoted more to operation at Tell Majnuna, and there were excavations in several small test trenches dispersed just along this destruction line that is visible here. And during those 2 seasons, it was possible to understand the stratigraphy of the site and the character of the site, because previously it was thought that this is just a kind of an outskirt of Tell Brak, and that there should be some buildings and some people lived there. But it appeared during the excavations that that's not true. There are almost no architectural remains except 2 or 3 very thin walls, and the majority of the site is just a midden, a large garbage dump where the inhabitants of the late Chalcolithic city simply gathered their garbage. So a lot of broken pieces of pottery, some sealings, a lot of ashes, and so on and so on. What was surprising was the presence of many human remains in that place. On the top of Tell Majnuna, there was a more or less regular symmetry, which may be expected in such a place. However, also in the lower parts, there were many clusters of human remains, and those clusters looked like that. Some of them included disarticulated or partially articulated human remains. Here, for example, you see humerus that is completely disarticulated, but here there is a hand and upper limb of one individual. Here we can see a spine of the same or other individual. So many articulations were preserved, even if the skeletons were highly incomplete in such kind of assemblage. However, in other places, human remains were completely disarticulated, sometimes mixed with a lot of animal bones. For example, here we can see very nice animal mandible. And it seemed that they were gathered in such a way after complete decay of any soft tissues. So there was a mystery what happened at Tell Majnuna, that the local inhabitants decided to place so many human remains in the midden without proper burial, except this burial on the top. And it was possible to distinguish between at least 4 major clusters of human remains. One of them is in the area MTW, and in that part of the site, human remains were only partially disarticulated. Another major assemblage of human remains was in the trench EM, and here there are only disarticulated and sometimes heavily fragmented human remains, as you see on this picture. In EMS, there were just a few clusters of disarticulated human remains, but also at least 2 partially articulated skeletons. And there were also 2 clusters of human remains in the area EME in 2 of those small trenches. So a lot of human remains. The minimum number of individuals in all those contexts was estimated as more than 200, and we can expect that because only a small fraction of the site was excavated, and because in every trench at some depth we found a lot of human remains, there may be even thousands of skeletons buried just in the midden, maybe not buried, disposed in the midden. So a kind of a mystery. It was possible to check the chronology of the site. We produced a series of radiocarbon dates. Unfortunately, only a few of them were based on carbonized cereals. Most of them were based on carbonates in human bone because unfortunately there was not enough collagen in human remains to date collagen. So we have just a series of dates from carbonates, which are less safe than collagen bones. But anyway, we can see that the site was used at least between, let's say, 38,000 BC to the very end of the late Chalcolithic, so 3100 BC. And we have at least 4 temporal subsets represented by several clusters at the site. And we know from a very intensive survey at Tell Brak and around Tell Brak that was done by Jason R. and his team that there was a very rapid urbanization process in the late Chalcolithic too, so something between 32 to 3700 BC. And finally, Tell Brak reached the size of more than 120 hectares, which was an enormous city of that time. After that, there was some time when this big city perhaps served as a local administration center. And after more or less 35,000 BC, we see the Uruk expansion to the north, the expansion of the southern Uruk culture that also established perhaps a kind of a colony at Tell Brak. And for a few centuries, Tell Brak was either controlled or coexisted with those southerners. And finally, there was a collapse and shrinkage of the city to much smaller area around 31,100 BC with the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Bronze Age. So what is most important is the information that most human remains at Tell Brak were disposed in the time of the peak of the settlement size, which may have some consequences that I will discuss a bit later. Anyway, when we look at those bones, there is very massive evidence of scavenging by carnivorous mammals. And both in those clusters where bones are completely disarticulated, and in the clusters where the skeletons were only partially disarticulated, we have really a massive evidence of scavenging. And the scavenging focuses mainly on those body parts that may produce the highest volume of muscles that could be eaten by those dogs or wolves or other carnivorous mammals present in the environment. So much more evidence of scavenging than elsewhere is in the proximal and distal femur, but also in the upper limb and occasionally also in the feet and shoulder and clavicle. No scavenging, or virtually no scavenging at crania and mandibles, because perhaps they were not as interesting for the scavengers. There is also some evidence of the interpersonal violence, especially in the area MTW. In this specific cluster of human remains, it was possible to observe several instances of well-healed cranial fractures, which are sometimes there are not very regular as here. Sometimes they are oval, and this is the evidence of relatively high level of interpersonal violence that is also indicated in Mesopotamia by a bit later cylindric seal showing how they fought against each other using maces, and those maces could leave similar traces on human heads as you see on the picture. What was also very surprising was number of processed human bones. So long bones that were used as a raw material for tool processing. And I have identified up to 40 such tools, which are not very sophisticated. And as you see, they simply look like primitive chisels, and they could serve for some digging in the ground or something of that sort. Anyway, there are quite many. There are up to 40 such elements at the site, which means that their production was not incidental. It was not just one attempt to do something with human remains, but someone really, or a group of people really used this assemblage of human remain as a raw material for producing bone tools. And tools of that kind are found occasionally also at other sites in the Near East. I saw very similar tool at Gohar Tepe in Iran, but they were just single specimens. But at Tell Majnuna, there is a high number of such tools in one of assemblages of human remains, and single specimens were also found in the other clusters. So this is also something completely unexpected. The excavations were completed in 2008, and since that time Tell Majnuna was not excavated. However, it was possible to take some tooth samples to Poland, and for that reason, in the meantime, in the past 15 years, I did some additional research trying to answer the question: what happened? Why all those people at Tell Majnuna were disposed in such a way? And here you can see results of one line of research that focused on some estimation of the shape index of femoral midshaft. And here are some 4 assemblages from Tell Majnuna, and also the collection of human remains from the early Bronze Age Tell Brak itself. And you can see that in the time of growing urban center, there is quite a evident change in the femoral midshaft shape index, but only in males, because here there is a distinction between large and small bones, and large bones belonged mainly to males, small bones belong mainly to females. And you can see that in females there are virtually no differences, but in males there is a very clear difference in the midshaft shape index. It's an increase of the midshaft shape index, and then there is very clear decrease between the time of the maximum development of the urban center through the end of the late Chalcolithic to the early Bronze Age. And in the early Bronze Age, there is no difference between males and females. And there is quite clear correlation between the femoral shape index in males and the frequency of linear enamel hypoplasia in the general population. Here, there are standardized values, so 0 is the average, and you see that both the frequency of the linear enamel hypoplasia and the average shape index go up until Tell Brak is growing, and then go down with decreased size of the site. So we can say that the rapid process of urbanization first was related to higher level of stress in a local population, but also to higher level of mobility expressed by the femoral shape index, because this shape index may be correlated with the how intensive are the lower limbs use, and actually we can expect that with the growing urban center, it was more and more time-consuming task to gather resources to feed all those people, and perhaps this single effect, the higher and higher distance from the cultivated fields, produced such effect. It was also possible to investigate stable strontium isotopes in human remains from Tell Majnuna, representing all those phases of occupation. And here we see the results that to some extent corroborate the results of this research on physical activity, because first, here we can quite easily identify outliers which were perhaps immigrants from elsewhere. So there are two in the assemblage from the trench EM, one in the trench MTW and one in the trench EME. EME is this top symmetry that was used in the very late in the very end of the late Chalcolithic. And we can see that in the oldest assemblage, most strontium isotope values are very close to the local plant background that was fortunately available for that part of Syria. And after that, we see that first there is a skew towards lower strontium isotope values, and we see that there is higher and higher dispersal, which may be also the evidence of including more distant fields into the local economy. So more distant fields were used to support the local population, to feed the local population. And after the collapse of the city, when it shrinked very rapidly towards the end of the late Bronze Age, again, we see that there are only local values without such dispersal. So what a picture emerges from those two lines of evidence is the growing city with growing demand in terms of subsistence, and with growing area from which the cereals have to be gathered to feed all those people, and it was also the higher effort in terms of transportation of this food to the city, because in that time it was no other possibility just to take some baskets or some bags with grain on the back of people. There were no donkeys or other pack animals that could be used for that task. Okay, so taking all this evidence, I tried to produce some interpretation vectors for the assemblages of human remains, and the most likely interpretations for the assemblages of human remains that were disposed in such a way in the midden was either the episode of starvation or the massacre of a local population, and actually they do not contradict each other, because we can imagine that the episode of famine could produce also a higher level of violence in a given group, so they could appear jointly. However, it was not possible at the very beginning to assess directly what could be the reason of such episode of famine. Of course, Tell Brak is located in relatively marginal dry farming zone with relatively low precipitation, and for that reason cereal cultivation is quite risky in this area. There are some years when humidity is far enough to support cereals and to produce very nice harvest, but there are also some dry years when the harvest is much less abundant. However, people living in that region are well aware that there is such fluctuation in humidity, and for that reason they always, since the Neolithic, they organized granaries just to keep surpluses from the good years to feed people in the bad years. So if the series of bad years is no longer than 1 or 2, everything should be okay. However, such a big city as Tell Brak in that time was perhaps more fragile, because it was necessary to feed much more people than just in some small villages in the countryside. So it was perhaps most affected, even by such episodes of drought that were not very problematic from the point of view of small human communities. However, there is a problem with direct estimation of drought at archaeological sites. Of course, there are some proxies. For example, we can look at the proportion of cereals. If we see more barley than wheat, it may indicate that there was higher aridity of, or if we see some resources that are usually not exploited, and they appear in archaeobotanical records, they may also indicate some worsening of the climate. However, this is the question of dating and the question of low resolution of such proxies, much lower than necessary to look for short time yearly fluctuations in humidity. Fortunately, we have a tool that allows direct insight into short-term climatic fluctuations, which is based on the combination of tooth histology and stable isotope measurements. We did cross sections of some teeth of children that were 7-8 years old in time of death and were buried as a part of this assemblage, assuming they died roughly in the same time because of any reason. And we noted that there is, in all those teeth, there is a area of very, very clear linear enamel hypoplasia, more or less in the same period. And we also measured oxygen stable isotope values in small dots along in the enamel along the dentin enamel junction. There is a spectrometer that is called sensitive high-resolution ion microprobe that allows relatively high-resolution measurements of oxygen stable isotopes in solid materials in a spots with size lower than 20 micrometers. So here you can see that it is possible to set more than 100 such spots along the dentin enamel junction, and because tooth enamel forms for several years, for up to 6 years in case of canines, and we use canines for this research, it is possible to reconstruct any fluctuations in oxygen isotope values with the resolution of 2-3 weeks. So the resolution that allows identification of seasonal variation, and the resolution that enables allows us to observe even short-term climatic fluctuations. So what happened when we did such research? Here you see oxygen isotope values just for one teeth, and it is possible to attribute them to years before death in that case, because it was a child that was born in the that was born something like 8 years before death. So we see here data for enamel, and the last year of life of these individuals is missing from the diagram because no more enamel was formed in that time, just dentin. But anyway, we have the coverage of 1, 2, 3, 4, more than 5 years of life of this individual, and we see that originally the oxygen isotope values go down, which is quite expected because this is the weaning time, and we expect higher oxygen isotope values in the time of breastfeeding, so we can catch the weaning in that part of the diagram. After that, there is a plateau and very clear raise of oxygen isotope values to much higher level even than in time of breastfeeding. So something happened just 4 years before death of this individual, something that increased oxygen isotope values. And oxygen isotope values are sensitive to temperature, because the higher temperature, the higher evaporation rate, and with increasing evaporation rate, there is also increasing proportion of heavier oxygen isotope in water. And for that reason, what we see here may be related to higher temperature during 4 years before death of this individual, and the higher temperature is the indicator of drought in these specific environmental conditions. Please also note that we corroborated the results by measuring spots on both lingual and labial side of the tooth and for that reason, we see that this is not that this pattern is not accidental, because it follows more or less the same pattern on both sides of the tooth. And here we have another individual. Please note that now the scale is different. It ends with 0 because it was one of adult individuals. So the individuals who were born in that case something like 20 years before death. And for that reason, what we see here is the fluctuation before the end of the enamel formation, which could happen perhaps 10, perhaps 12 years before death of this individual. And please note that first there is a signal from seasonality, and again the patterns on both lingual and labial sides are roughly the same. So when we compare data from 4 individuals that died between 7 and 8 years, we see more or less the same pattern. First, the oxygen isotope values go down, which may be attributed to weaning. Then there is some plateau, some stabilization of results, and after that we see very clear rise in oxygen isotope values, and the time when they increase is correlated with the time of enamel hypoplasia. Those bars at the top show the period when the linear enamel hypoplasia is observed in incremental layers of enamel, representing that time, growth time in life of this individual. So you see here that there is quite a clear shift in all those individuals, and there is only one small difference with the individual C, in which everything happened perhaps 1 year later. However, it is not impossible that if indeed it was a time of starvation, some individuals died earlier than the others, and some survived for a bit more time, and after the death their bodies remained somewhere exposed in the fresh air, and they were eaten by the scavenging animals, and only a few weeks or even months later someone ordered to collect all those bodies and to dispose them in the midden. So the evidence from the measurement of the oxygen isotope values produces quite a strong evidence that there was a period of drought at least 4 or maybe even 5 years before death of those individuals. And taking into account the fragility of Tell Brak as a very big population, it could indeed produce mass death that led to such gruesome assemblage of human remains. And when we compare data from those 7-8 years old children with the young adult individuals, we see that in the young adults the trajectory is different. In some individuals there is some signal from seasonality. In the others there is no signal from seasonality, but also no rise of oxygen isotope values. Only in this one individual there is some increase, but then decrease towards the lower part of the enamel. And for sure this individual survived, even if it was a period of minor drought in the life of this specific individual. And when we take all this evidence into account, we see that the increased oxygen isotope values in 4 studied subadult individuals may indicate the prolonged drought that started 4-5 years before their death. And 4 years of drought is a lot, and it may lead to famine, to starvation, and also to social upheaval in the early urban center. We can imagine that also the level of interpersonal violence could rise because of this deficiency of food. And there is some analogy to the drought of 2007-2009, because just in the years after initial identification of Tell Majnuna, there were 2 years of drought that finally ended with the social upheaval that developed into the Syrian civil war. I wouldn't like to talk very much about this contemporary event, but it shows that that even 2 years of drought sometimes are enough to produce some calamities to a local population. Okay, so that's all from me. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and